Oh, hey there. Prequels. Whether you love them or you hate them, it seems to be inevitable that once a series goes on for long enough, the creators like to circle back around and create a prequel, often as an attempt to further expand the lore or explain how everything got started. I've always felt that when it comes to books and movies, audiences are less enthusiastic when it comes to the idea of a prequel because they already know where the story is going to go. However, in the world of video games, prequels are often some of the best in the series. Yakuza 0, Metal Gear Solid 3, Devil May Cry 3, hell, Yoshi's Island even. They're all great games. So how about Castlevania? A series that, for the most part, has a story often described as, it exists, but has never been a strong point in the series. Was it able to pull off the prequel? Well, I mean, the answer is yes, because Castlevania 3 is also a prequel, and that game is rad. But this is not about Castlevania 3. That's right. This is just another video about Castlevania Lament of Innocence. In my Java for Castlevania on the NES, I said that it was the first game in a long-running series. But, depending on how you want to look at it, Castlevania Lament of Innocence is also the first game in a long-running series. But it's also the Castlevania game that I have the least personal connection to. You see, Lament of Innocence came out in 2003, but it was one of the games that just kind of slipped under the radar for me. It didn't help that Aria of Sorrow came out that same year, as well as a slew of other games, such as Final Fantasy X-2, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, and The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, just to name a few. I was only 16 or 17 back then, meaning I didn't really have the money to spend on whatever games I wanted, nor was I all that in the know about what was coming out, because social media just wasn't really a thing like it is today. Instead, people tended to fixate on maybe 1 or 2 titles at a time for what felt like forever, and we were all pretty content with that. So for me, I was pretty obsessed with Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and that game came out at the end of 2002. But we're getting a bit off track. The point is that this is one of the few Castlevania games that I did not get to play as soon as it was released. Instead, it became one of those mythical games that once I ended up reading about, I really built up in my head about how cool it must be. I heard about the entire story secondhand from friends on the internet. I read all about it on Castlevania fan sites like the Castlevania Dungeon. It'd be quite a few years before I could actually get my hands on the game and play it, and at the time, I wasn't really blown away by it, but that's not to say that it was bad either. I do think a big issue for myself was the fact that I had built it up in my head for so long, and there was just no way that it could meet those expectations. But let's back up and I'll actually talk about the game and my most recent foray into it. This wasn't Konami's first foray into a 3D Castlevania title. It was actually their third, but it had been quite a while since they had made an attempt to do so. 4 years, in fact. You take the role of Leon Belmont back in the year 1094. Leon was a knight that fought for the church and whose skill in combat was quite renowned. Together with his best friend Matthias Konkvist, a skilled tactician, they were known to be invincible in combat. While away on expedition, Matthias' wife, Elisabetta, fell ill and eventually died. This left Matthias bedridden with grief. Not long after, Leon's own betrothed, Sarah, was kidnapped by a vampire and brought to a castle in a mystical forest of eternal night. Determined to rescue her, Leon renounces his title of Baron and heads off into the forest. Upon arriving, Leon meets an alchemist named Ronaldo, who gifts Leon the Whip of Alchemy to help him destroy various evils in the castle. It's kind of funny because he's supposed to be this great warrior, but he talks about leaving his sword behind, and then he seems to be confused as to what a whip even is. But honestly, he takes to it so easily. I don't think that I could ever master something 15 seconds after I learned what it even is.
Casual.
Who is that?
Come on, AJ. You've been talking about all these Castlevanias and you don't even own a whip? I bought one just for my video on Lament. Got it right here.
You sure you know how to use that?
Well, how hard could it be? Please check out my vid on Lament.
Anyway, That's about all the story in the game, except for like 2 more cutscenes. From this point on, Leon ventures into the castle, and we won't really see anything else of importance until basically the end of the game. As I've already said, this is indeed a Castlevania game, but it's not really a Metroidvania or search action game like many of the previous titles. This is really just a 3D action game wearing a Castlevania skin. You control Leon in a 3D space, being able to run in all directions, perform various whip attacks, as well as jump and even double jump. As per the usual with Castlevania titles, there are also sub-weapons such as knives, axes, the cross, and holy water, but we'll talk more about those in a bit when we get into the meat of the combat. While the game is 3D, the player has no control over the camera. The game instead uses a semi-fixed camera that will remain stationary and occasionally turn based off of your own movements. For the most part, this does work, but it can still lead to some frustrating moments where an enemy from off-screen manages to hit you because you had no way of seeing it. Movement-wise, it feels pretty good. There are times that the movement can feel really solid, and other times that it can kind of be frustratingly bad. The main issue I had with the movement is that the platforming just isn't good at times. There's this weird reliance on the whip that doesn't feel like it was implemented as well as it could have been. As I mentioned earlier, you do have a double jump, but there are occasions where you can use the whip in midair to do what is essentially a third jump. This is often necessary to reach certain ledges or solve puzzles, but it just doesn't feel as good as it should. I'd often just be wishing Leon would grab the ledge normally instead of whipping it and doing this awkward acrobatic flip up to where I was going. And when you have to essentially pogo across multiple ledges or quickly ascend one of the game's various puzzles that's on a timer, it can lead to some frustration when you mess up. But for the most part, I can easily chalk this up to being a PS2 game from the early 2000s, so it's bound to have a bit of jank to it as the formula was still being perfected. So let's move on and talk about the combat I mentioned earlier. When it comes to whip attacks, they're separated into light and heavy. Pressing the square button will do light attacks, while pressing the triangle will do heavy attacks. You're able to alternate between the two to mix it up some. Alongside this, Leon can hold R1 to initiate a guard, allowing you to block attacks, and with precise timing, you're able to do a perfect guard, which will restore some of your MP. While in the guarding stance, if you attempt to move, Leon will instead strafe sideways while continuing to look in the initial guard position. You're also able to perform a quick step by pressing X while guarding and holding the direction you'd like to move in with the analog stick. There are some attacks that cannot be guarded, and therefore the quick step with its invincibility frames will be necessary to avoid taking damage. As you defeat enemies, you'll slowly unlock new abilities. This is dependent on how many enemies you've defeated, as well as how many types of enemies you've defeated. The abilities range from additional attacks in your standard whip combos, entirely new whip combos, additional quick steps, a dive kick, etc. Think of these as a nice little bonus or reward for defeating multiple enemies. They are in no way necessary for beating the game, but having them can be quite handy, especially the additional quick steps. Overall, the combat does feel quite good. Between the various whip combos, blocks, and parries, as well as your sub-weapons, it's just genuinely fun fighting enemies. Speaking of sub-weapons, as mentioned earlier, most of the mainstay Castlevania sub-weapons make an appearance here. As with previous games, using your sub-weapons requires hearts, which can be replenished by destroying candles or using a heart replenishing item. Overall, the sub-weapons have translated quite nicely to 3D. In their basic forms, they work quite well, but where they really shine is when you combine them with orbs. As you progress through the game and defeat various bosses, you'll often be rewarded with a colored orb. One of these orbs can be equipped at a time, resulting in a dramatic change to how each sub-weapon works. The heart usage will also change accordingly, and while it's not entirely the case, I do feel like you can get an idea of what the stronger attacks are based purely off of how many hearts are consumed when using them. That being said, I did find myself often just sticking with only a couple of sub-weapons, mainly because I found combinations that worked and just never saw a need to change. But that's really just a personal issue there. As for the music, we've got the return of the super talented Michiru Yamane, the very same composer from Castlevania Bloodlines, as well as Castlevania Symphony of the Night. If you've watched my previous Castlevania videos, then you know that I'm a fan of her work, and her talent is on display here. That being said, this isn't one of my favorite OSTs. It does still have some pretty good tracks in it. Leon's theme and the Anti-Souls Mystery Labs are standouts, and the Dark Palace Waterfalls definitely feels like a Castlevania song. But for the most part, a lot of the music just kind of comes off as very PS2 era music. It's kind of hard to explain, but PS2 games in the early 2000s all kind of had this electronic sound to them, to the point where the songs were less of a standout, less of a bop, and more atmospheric, which is something that I absolutely would not expect from a Castlevania game. These games have always had very strong OSTs with a lot of oomph in them, but I just don't get that same feeling from Lament of Innocence. The music isn't bad by any means, it just doesn't move me forward or energize me in the way that the previous game's OSTs did. But that's just my opinion. Let's hear from someone who really loves it.
Bet you never ask. The musical vibes of Castlevania have evolved more than a teenager going through growth phases. There was the chiptune phase, the rock phase, the elegant phase, and it even had some bizarrely funky phases. Lament of Innocence was Michiru Yumane's chance to roll up her sleeves and put her classical inspirations to work, resulting in a soundtrack that I call the classiest in the series. Zones like the House of Sacred Remains and the Ghostly Theater had these overwhelmingly powerful moments that stir the soul and send chills down my spine. They give each zone life and a very distinct personality, and once you step into the Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab for the first time, you won't forget it in a hurry. I go into much more detail about the soundtrack in my video, so come check it out sometime. Back to you, AJ.
So let's talk about the structure of the game. As I said earlier, this is a Castlevania game, but it's not a Metroidvania or search action game. But what does that actually mean? Typically, in search action games such as Symphony of the Night or Aria of Sorrow, you explore through various areas, looking for abilities or items that act as keys, allowing you to access new locations. There's an emphasis on backtracking, revisiting areas with new abilities to see if you can reach a ledge or something you weren't able to get to before. Meanwhile, Lament of Innocence does not play like this at all. A surface level glance at the map might make you think otherwise, but once you start playing, you realize that it's very different. You see, the start of the game acts as a central hub. Outside the castle is Ronaldo's shack, and you can return here to buy items and equipment as the game progresses. Inside the castle, you have access to just a couple of rooms. There's the main hall, a tutorial area, and then a room with 5 elevators, all which take you to the levels you'll be playing through. Your goal is to reach the top of the castle, but to do so, you need to defeat 5 bosses to break a seal, allowing you to access the upper levels of the castle. Hell, in a way, the structure is closer to Mario 64 than it is to previous Castlevania games. You can do the stages in any order, but the game does sort of guide you towards the House of Sacred Remains first. But this is where things get a little weird. While there is no set order to these stages, they do still have different levels of difficulty to them. On top of that, only some of the levels have any sort of cutscene tied to them. That means depending on the order that you do the levels in, you could end up with either a front half that's very story loaded or a back half that's very story loaded. There's nothing listing the difficulty of the stages prior to playing them, but you'll notice right away that the Dark Palace of Waterfalls is definitely a step up difficulty wise to the Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab. As for the stages themselves, they're alright. There are some screens that make you really feel like you're exploring Castlevania, but then you'll come across a screen that's been copy and pasted like 7 times, and it'll totally shatter that immersion. If I had to guess, this is just to pad the game to make it seem bigger or longer than it actually is. But it becomes extremely noticeable once you've gone through the same screen multiple times. A lot of the rooms also require you to defeat every enemy in them so you can proceed, as the doors will all lock the moment you enter. I didn't mind this too much because once you've done it, if you leave the room and come back to revive the enemies, it doesn't relock the doors, so you can quickly just run through the room again without issue. But I did start feeling it towards the end of the game, as it became extremely common later on, to the point where almost every single room was set up like a mini gauntlet that you had to overcome. I'd guess that the reasoning behind this is because otherwise, players might just run through every single room and not fight any enemies, since it can be rather easy to avoid most things in a 3-dimensional space, as opposed to a 2D space where enemies can block your path by simply existing. But since they decided to copy and paste rooms multiple times, you really do start feeling it later on. Out of all the stages, I actually probably liked the Dark Palace of Waterfalls the most. While it does suffer from the copy-paste issue present across the game, it has a good atmosphere to it and some pretty fun exploration. It also helps that, as mentioned earlier, the music here feels extremely Castlevania coded. Granted, I could absolutely do without this weird Sonic 2 bonus section that kept popping up in the level. Why is this even here? What is this? What's going on here? It moves so fast that you can't even really grasp what you're doing or seeing until you either get paid or get hurt. At the end of each stage, you encounter a boss, and honestly, I really enjoyed most of the bosses in this game. I'm not going to go into like super detail about each and every one, but I did want to draw some attention to some that I thought were neat. The golem in the Anti-Soul Mysteries Lab shouldn't be as fun of a fight as it is, but I think a big part of that is the fact that this was the first difficult fight in the game, assuming that you did this stage early on, that is. It's not particularly hard, but it's a step up from the undead parasite in the House of Sacred Remains. Medusa is another memorable experience, and the only representation of the original classic bosses found in the first Castlevania game. They also gave her bloody tears, which to me has always been a Camilla thing, but the reference is nice either way. Joachim is another memorable boss, found in the Dark Palace of Waterfalls. This character is weird though, because it feels like they had a lot more planned for him story-wise, but it just got left on the cutting room floor or something. The fight itself can be a little tedious due to having some gimmicky mechanics, but it still presents a decent challenge. When it comes to combat, the bosses in this game is where it really gets to shine, because you see, while I do like the combat, I felt that a lot of the basic enemies are far tankier than they have any right being. So you find yourself just doing the same combos on them repeatedly until they die. But since bosses have a lot more attack patterns and things you need to watch out for, it just makes them a lot more fun to fight, since you no longer feel like you're just button mashing. You actually need to guard and dodge effectively while attacking. So how's the exploration? Well, it's sort of there. Like I said, this is no Metroidvania, but it's not entirely linear either. Each stage does have branching paths, but oftentimes the rewards are quite middling. Typically, once you stray off the main route, you'll eventually end up in what amounts to being a copy and pasted reward room, giving you like an HP up or accessory of some sort. None of these are really required, but it is nice that they exist. There are also a couple of secret bosses you can find that will lead to much better rewards, such as the elemental whips. I'm a big fan of the location of the ice elemental, because it definitely feels like an area that you shouldn't be able to get to, involving a lot of ascension via some vertical platforming. Lastly, there are these locked doors you'll find, and the trick to these is that the key for them is found in an entirely different stage. For instance, the Blue Dragon key is found in the Dark Palace of Waterfalls, and unlocks the Blue Dragon door in the Garden Forgotten by Time. This is a neat idea in theory, but the backtracking between various areas can become a little tedious, and ultimately you just end up in that same copy and pasted treasure room to get a reward that isn't all that useful, or at the very least, worth the time to backtrack for. I think I'd be a little bit more open to the exploration in this game if it didn't have so many copy and pasted rooms and a vast gauntlet of enemies that you need to get through to traverse each one of them. It just makes it feel a bit bloated at times. Like sure, I could spend 10 minutes searching a map for a key and then spend another 10 minutes looking for the door that it belongs to on another map, assuming you even ran into that door to begin with and remember the map that it was on, just to be awarded with the ability to like equip another accessory or something. Or I could just ignore all of that and just progress the game normally because it really won't feel that different either way. This game also has relics, but they are unlike the relics found in previous Castlevania titles. Instead, you can equip one of these at a time and then spend MP to activate them. There aren't too many relics this go around, and the effects are just sort of okay. On my latest playthrough, I never even bothered to switch my relic from the default Svarog statue, which makes it so Leon leaves a trail of fire while he runs, which can be handy when fighting mobs. The other relics in the game have effects such as increasing your defense for a time, gradually recovering hearts or HP, temporarily increasing your attack, turn you invisible, etc. It's all stuff that, while neat as an added bonus, I just never really found myself using. Now after you beat all 5 stages, you'll finally be able to reach the top of the castle, and this is where some more story plays out. Leon's whip gets upgraded to the vampire killer that the series is so well known for, and it should just be a straight shot to the boss. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The way the final area of the game, Pagoda of the Misty Moon, is laid out can be quite confusing. At first, it's just a straight shot through some hallways, fighting off or avoiding various enemies. Once you reach the next floor, Leon's theme kicks in, almost as a motivational tool to continue pushing you forward, but you'll quickly find the path splits, and depending on which way you choose to go, you can end up wasting a ton of time. I have a distinct memory of the first time I ever did this. I was stumbling through these halls and eventually wound up here, at the iconic staircase leading to the final boss. It was so cool to see this again, and as I made my way up the stairs, ready to tackle the final challenge in the game, I was greeted with this. What? Why though? Why here? If you wanted to add one more puzzle to the game, that's fine, but why place it here? Why not place it at the door leading to this area instead? Why let the player walk through the door, have the atmosphere change, be greeted with the staircase, and then a text box that blocks their path and makes them just awkwardly run back down the stairs to continue exploring until they can solve the puzzle? It made such a cool moment into something so anticlimactic, and if I'm being honest, a little frustrating, because by the time you reach this point, you're usually ready to wrap up the game. So yeah, basically the Pagoda of the Misty Moon has 3 paths you can go down. You need to go down one specific path to get an item to place into a switch in the middle path to eventually open up the door to the final boss. You can also find a secret item here that will open up a secret location in the early part of the castle, leading to this game's super boss if you so wish. It can be a pretty challenging fight since you can easily get comboed into what amounts to being a one-hit KO, but it is still fun. Anyway, after solving the final puzzle and choosing to fight or skip the super boss, you can finally make your way up those iconic stairs and into the throne room to fight Walter, this game's antagonistic vampire that stole away Leon's betrothed. So I'm going to talk about the ending, including some story spoilers. So if you don't want that spoiled for you, you can just jump to this timestamp right here. After defeating Walter, Death, yes, that Death, comes in and finishes Walter off. We then find out that this whole series of events has been orchestrated by Matthias. He wanted Leon to kill Walter so he could get his hands on a MacGuffin called the Ebony Stone to take Walter's power for himself. Alongside the Crimson Stone, which he already had that gives him control over Death, he's able to become an immortal vampire, control Castlevania, and eventually becoming Dracula. He did all of this to curse God after his wife's passing. He then orders Death to kill Leon, due to Leon refusing to side with him. So the final boss is actually Death, which if I'm being a little honest, is kind of a lame final boss thematically speaking. Death is usually always a character that just kind of shows up in these games, as Dracula's sort of second in command, lackey of sorts. Outside of a handful of games, he barely even gets dialogue. So for him to be the final boss is such a weird choice. That's right, the one who orchestrated the whole ordeal just dips and you never see him again. Meaning there is no final showdown with Dracula or anything. After defeating Death, instead of getting any sort of closure, Leon swears that his clan will hunt the night, and thus ends Lament of Innocence and begins the story of the future Belmonts. This is just so, I don't know, weird. This is purely speculation on my part, but maybe there was some sort of planned sequel in the future where Leon could finally throw down with the one that caused him so much grief. But really, he should have and could have just done it here in this game. In most Castlevania games, the Dracula fight is always 2 phases. Regular vampire phase 1 and then big evil demon monster phase 2. In this game, Walter's fight is basically Dracula phase 1. Okay, so hear me out. Instead of fighting Death, have it so after defeating Walter and his power gets absorbed by the manipulator, make it so they turn into that big phase 2 demon monster mode. You fight that, and then upon winning, they can give some sort of speech about being immortal and they're going to return. And then Leon can give his iconic, hey, that's cool, except my family, we're going to fight the night. So good luck with that. Bam, ending. Leon gets his closure. And that way, we do not end the game with fighting Death, a character with absolutely zero relevance to Leon's story. After beating the game, there are some unlockables. If you enter the name Joachim with an @ symbol in front of it, you can play as the boss of the same name. He floats around with various sword attacks at his disposal. He definitely doesn't feel as fleshed out as your typical second playable character, but his mere inclusion here makes me again think that there's probably supposed to be some more story significance that was cut down by release. There's also Crazy Mode, which is just a harder difficulty. And lastly, beating the game with Joachim unlocks Pumpkin as a character, who plays and controls similar to Leon, but has some unique attacks with his sub-weapons. All things considered, I love that this game even has unlockables like this, because things like this just aren't too common nowadays. So how do I feel about Lament of Innocence? Well, regardless of how this video may sound, I actually do like the game. I do have fun playing it, but it's one of the games that I have a hard time looking past the faults on. And I'll admit, it doesn't help that I didn't play this game growing up, because playing games in your formative years really does change your perception of them later on. I do know that this game often gets compared to Capcom's Devil May Cry, but honestly, I think that there's enough differences that it can stand on its own as a 3D action game. It does a lot of things right and does a lot of things wrong. The atmosphere of the castle is so good at times, but then you stumble across one of those copy and pasted rooms and it just kind of ruins that. Fighting enemies is usually pretty fun, but then you start seeing the same enemies over and over again across the stages, becoming tankier. Oftentimes, you have to fight them to progress, so therefore combat just starts to feel repetitive. The story isn't bad by any means, and it's cool to see the start of Castlevania, even if it does cause some continuity errors in the series later on down the line. This isn't a series whose story I've ever really taken all that seriously, but at the same time, the ending just does kind of fall a little flat and feel a little anticlimactic. There's this belief that Castlevania games haven't been or just can't be translated to 3D very well, and I just don't think that's true. I think that in the same way that the classic games are very different than the Metroidvania search action style of games, the 3D games also deserve their own category. Castlevania Lament of Innocence is still a fun video game and it holds up just fine, but you have to go into it expecting some of that early 2000s video game jank. It very much feels like a game from the early 2000s, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. If you like Castlevania and you're even mildly interested in checking it out, then I do recommend playing it. Being a PS2 game, it can be a little harder to find nowadays because it hasn't seen any sort of re-release on modern consoles or on PC. But if you're determined enough, then I'm sure you can find it if you catch my drift. And who knows, while I was covering the GBA games, we got the Advanced Collection. And while covering the DS games, I said, I bet we're gonna get a DS collection here in the future, and a year later, we did. So, maybe we'll get a PS2 collection here in the future. Anyway, what do you think about the game? Have you played it? Will you play it? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, huge thanks to Skelly for reaching out to do these collab videos. I highly recommend you go watch his Lament of Innocence video. And who knows, you might even see a little bit more of me in it. I'll link to that down below. That being said, my name is AJ. This is the second Java in a row that I have forgotten my coffee, but this was still just another video about Castlevania Lament of Innocence.